Hi guys, Cory here. For my persuasive speech, I chose to do it on No Child Left Behind. For those of you that don't know what it is or have heard about it, don't know exactly what it is, it was the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which was implemented by our President George W. Bush at the time, and it was supposed to be a focus on the education system, and it was meant to help minorities and low-income students who, they were the ones who usually scored lower on tests or anything, but it really just focused on any student that had poor grades. But it didn't really help the students so much. It just kind of pushed the schools and the teachers to bump up the grades. And the students were pushed forward. They weren't really helped at all. As Damon Hewitt said in Reauthorize, Revise, and Remember, he said the law focuses on test scores as a measure of the student's achievement without any actual reference to student growth. This led many states to lower their standards and curriculums to meet the specific demands of the testing regimes of No Child Left Behind. Well, this doesn't really make any sense, because instead of helping the students get better, you're just lowering the standards for the students. That doesn't help anybody. A perfect example of this, and I'm going to refer to him often throughout this, was my brother. He was actually pushed forward in school quite often. He had slight learning disabilities, and they'd never explained anything to him. They just made him memorize certain stuff that they knew was going to be on the tests, because they wanted him to pass the tests. As Kayla Webley said in Why It's Time to Replace No Child Left Behind, when students didn't do well on the annual state tests, they're not penalized under No Child Left Behind. The school is. So basically, from a child's perspective, there's no consequences for not learning. So when they did poorly on the tests, it didn't actually reflect anything in their grades. So why do you even care about these specific tests? But the teachers kept pushing the students and pushing the students. Well, if you have a hard time learning, like my brother did, you just keep getting you get information pushed down your throat. You don't have time to understand it, and the teachers can't take the time to actually explain the information, so they just keep pushing you, and when you don't understand something at a base level, you can't expand from there. And that's what happened to my brother. And then they wonder why the students can't learn. But then, as Damon, again, in Reauthorize, Revise, Remember, he said, some have argued that the number of students pushed out of schools has skyrocketed after No Child Left Behind was adopted because of pressure to excel on the high-stakes tests. So, the students were actually pushed out of the school, which is awful. You're trying to help students, or the entire idea of No Child Left Behind was to help the students excel, and instead the ideals were so high, and the curriculum was just so ridiculous that they couldn't help these students. They just had to push them away. And my brother actually told me that he saw troubled students being suspended and expelled from school like right before these big tests for the school from the state, um, they were being suspended and expelled because then they were exempt from actually taking any of the tests, which doesn't make any sense because that still doesn't help the students at all. So they're just being pushed further and further away. They're not learning anything. It's not helping them, but it's bumping up the numbers of the school, so it makes the schools look better, even though you're hurting the kids that this entire act was put forth to help. Um, and then the people like my brother who were just at that line of, okay, I can learn a little bit and my numbers are getting better. They didn't want to suspend them, but then he was under so much pressure from the teachers to do better. He started having anxiety problems, and it's a shame to see somebody struggling so hard and the teachers can't take extra time to help them because then they they won't um, they won't be able to cover all the material that they need to cover. um, and you're monitored so much more closely because the schools were not based on how well your good students did. You could have 1,000 students with an A average, and you have 10 students that have a D average. No Child Left Behind is only worried about those 10 students with a D average. So if they don't get better, the schools were actually labeled as a failing school system, even though you still have 1,000 kids that are superseding their expectations. They're only worried about those 10. Um, and if you can't get those 10 to bump up their grades, some schools, like I said, my brother saw, started suspending and expelling these students because then they were exempt. So if you suspend one of these students out of the 10, your numbers bump up by 10%. That looks great for the school, but it doesn't help the kids at all. They didn't learn anything. They just got suspended. And the added pressure for the kids that were on that line was just phenomenal. And as Annie Murphy said in Relax, It's Only a Test, this anxiety can expand over time into any situation in which a student is conscious of being evaluated and can lead to diminished self-esteem, reduced motivation, and disengagement from school altogether. And again, going back to my brother, I can clearly see that after he did make it all the way through high school and he graduated. He wasn't at like anywhere near the top of the class. He was very close to the bottom of the class, but he still passed, and he still had acceptable grades. They weren't great, but they were acceptable. But by the time he got to college, he felt way too much pressure. He didn't have anything to build on because he was never taught the basics. He was only taught what was going to be on the tests. So when he got to college, he didn't have any of that previous knowledge, so he had nothing to build on, and he felt more and more pressure. He felt more and more disengaged, and he actually ended up dropping out of college after the second semester. And it wasn't even full time. I think he took maybe 6 classes, and then he completely just dropped out and hasn't been back since because he did not understand any of the material and he felt like he couldn't get help. And this is a perfect example of why No Child Left Behind actually hurts the youth of our nation instead of helps them, because they're just focused on test scores. They're not focused on the actual person. This is not a one size fits all, and it needs to be gotten rid of because it does not help one person. It's focused on numbers, and that's it. So we need to get rid of this system as soon as possible and get back to focusing on the students and what the students need. Thank you guys, and I'll see you on the next speech.